Good morning, colleagues. So welcome to the side event on day 2 of NGM to discuss managing explosive hazards in cities. Lessons from Sudan, Gaza, Syria and Iraq. Can you hear me? Yeah? No, you cannot hear me. Okay. I will try to speak louder and get closer to the mic. Okay. So, a couple of points to introduce the topic. Urban conflict creates highly hazardous environment. Unexploded ordnance becomes entangled with collapsed buildings, buried under debris, and hidden within the very fabric of the city. In Khartoum, in Gaza, in Mosul, Raqqa, Aleppo, explosive hazard in dense neighborhoods don't just block reconstruction, they shape whether or not people will be able to return home. Today, we have experts who have lived or are living this reality. And this is my pleasure to introduce our 4 experts today. So first, to my left, Major General Hamdan, who is the National Director of Mine Action in Sudan and has been for the past 6 years. Welcome. Secondly, I have also Dr. Al-Hassan Asnahi, who is the Deputy Minister of the Environment Ministry in Iraq. Thank you very much for joining us today. Iraq has a huge amount of experience to share, so we're really glad to have you. And lastly, we have 2 of the top UNMAS programs in urban area. The chief of those 2 programs are here with us today. So first, we have Julius van der Walt, who works in Gaza. And secondly, we have Joe McCartan, who is our chief in Syria. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for coming to speak about this very difficult topic. So managing unexploding ordnance in city forces us to rethink the basics. Urban contamination is 3-dimensional, horizontal, vertical, and deeply embedded in debris, making clearance slower, riskier, far more complex, and often far more expensive. Streets become access routes and blast corridors. High-rise buildings become unstable platforms, and civilian presence never fully disappears. So protecting civilians during this operation is a key concern. The question is no longer only how to clear land, but how to restore a functioning city when risks remain. The countries represented here have generated some of the most important lessons of the past decade, from emergency clearance in active conflict to large-scale urban recovery. Their insights can help shape future standards and expectations for urban explosive hazard management. So I'm going to start by giving the floor to Major General Hamdan to talk to us about the situation in Sudan, the challenges and the plan to deal with them. Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا. I'll speak in Arabic.
There is interpretation.
الحضور الكريم، السيدات والسادة، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. يسعدني ويشرفني أن أرحب بكم جميعا في هذه الجلسة الهامة ضمن هذا الحدث الجانبي الذي يناقش قضايا التلوث في المدن، وأتمنى أن أقدم اليوم طرحا يثري النقاش ويساهم في تعزيز فهمنا المشترك للتحديات والفرص المرتبطة بالاستجابة الطارئة والتوسع السريع في قطاع مكافحة الألغام في السودان. لقد عانى السودان منذ عقود من التلوث بالمخلفات الحربية نتيجة نزاعات معقدة ممتدة تركت آثار عميقة على الإنسان والبيئة. ورغم ذلك فقد بدأ السودان مبكرا في بذل جهود حثيثة للتخلص من هذه المخلفات وتقليل آثارها، وحقق تقدما ملحوظا في هذا المجال. إلا أن اندلاع الحرب الأخيرة في العام 2023 أدى إلى انتشار واسع وغير مسبوق للمخلفات الحربية، خاصة في المدن والمناطق الحضرية. وقد تفاقم الوضع كثيرا بوجود المواطنين داخل هذه المناطق الملوثة، بل وحتى مسارات النزوح نفسها كانت تمر عبر أراضي ملوثة، مما أدى إلى وقوع عدد كبير من الحوادث التي نتجت عنها إصابات ووفيات. كما تسببت الحرب في فقدان أصول ومعدات وآليات مكافحة الألغام التابعة للمركز وشركائه، الأمر الذي زاد من تعقيد الاستجابة. رغم حجم التحديات، لم يتأخر المركز وشركائه في اتخاذ الإجراءات اللازمة للتصدي لهذه الأزمة، حيث تم نشر الفرق في المناطق الآمنة وتنفيذ حملات توعية واسعة النطاق عبر وسائل الإعلام والتواصل ومنصات التواصل الاجتماعي وعبر العاملين في المجال الإنساني، مما أسهم في الوصول إلى أعداد كبيرة من المستفيدين. كما تم تطهير مساحات واسعة من الأراضي وتدمير أكثر من 20,000 من الذخائر غير منفجرة بواسطة فرق الإزالة التي تم نشرها في الولايات الآمنة. وفيما يتعلق بدعم الضحايا، عمل المركز على حصر الناجين من الحوادث وتقديم التدخلات اللازمة لهم عبر المؤسسات الصحية. كما تم تخصيص خط ساخن مجاني متاح عبر جميع شركات الاتصالات في السودان لتلقي البلاغات والاستجابة السريعة لها حسب نداءات المواطنين. إلى جانب ذلك، فقد ساهم المركز في توسيع نطاق عمل المنظمات الوطنية والدولية في مجال مكافحة الألغام لتلبية الحاجة المتزايدة لفرق الإزالة. كما تم تنفيذ عدد من الدورات التدريبية المستويين الأول والثاني. رغم ذلك، فإن هنالك الكثير من التحديات برزت خلال تنفيذ هذه الجهود. أول هذا التحدي وهو تحدي لجميع شركاء مكافحة الألغام محدودية التمويل. أيضا أكبر تحدي كان عودة المواطنين إلى المناطق الملوثة قبل استكمال عمليات التطهير، وبالتالي ذلك يزيد من عدد الحوادث التي تحدث نتيجة لهذه العودة غير الآمنة. أيضا صعوبة تحديد الأولويات في ظل محدودية الفرق مقارنة بحجم الاحتياج. أيضا برزت الحاجة لتحديد المعايير لتواكب طبيعة التلوث الجديد، خاصة في البيئات الحضرية. كل العمل في السابق كان يتم في بيئات ريفية لا تكثر بها المباني، لكن التحدي الأكبر كان يتمثل حتى في عدم تمويل السلطات الوطنية للقيام بأعمالها في سبيل تنفيذ أعمال مكافحة الألغام في السودان. ما يمكن أن يستفاد من تجربة السودان: أولا، ضرورة التوسع في التوعية الإعلامية بالتوازي مع تعزيز قدرات فرق الإزالة. معلوم أن أعمال الإزالة تحتاج إلى مزيد من الوقت، وبالتالي يمكن شغل هذه الفترة بمزيد من التوعية لتقليل الحوادث وتأمين حركة المواطنين في المناطق الآمنة. أيضا إعطاء الأولوية للفرق الصغيرة الأكثر مرونة وسرعة في الاستجابة، يليها دعم الفرق الأكبر إذا توفر التمويل. أيضا التركيز على المهام الموضوعية في المناطق ذات التأثير الأكبر على حياة المواطنين. الأولويات تبدأ في مناطق احتياج المواطنين ثم تنتقل إلى أولويات أقل حسب الحاجة. الاستثمار المبكر في بناء القدرات الوطنية عبر دعم المنظمات المحلية مع الاستفادة من الشركات الدولية. تطوير الأنظمة من خلال تحديث المعايير للتواكب مع الأخطار الجديدة وتعزيز إجراءات السلامة الحيوية بما يتناسب مع طبيعة المخاطر الجديدة في السودان. والأهم هو دمج أنشطة مكافحة الألغام ضمن الاستراتيجيات الوطنية وخطط الأمم المتحدة الأوسع بما يعزز التنسيق ويدعم جهود التمويل وتحديد الأولويات. دمج هذه الأنشطة ضمن خطط الحكومة والأمم المتحدة هي كانت السبيل لتوفير مزيدا من التمويل لهذا البرنامج. في الختام أود أن أعبر عن خالص شكري وتقديري لحضوركم الكريم واهتمامكم بهذه القضية الإنسانية المهمة، وإن دعمكم وتعاونكم يمثلان حجر الأساس في تمكين السودان من مواجهة هذه التحديات وبناء مستقبل أكثر أمانا واستقرارا لمواطنيه. شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you very much, Major General, and I will move straight away to Julius to talk about Gaza. Thank you.
Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, fellow mine action enthusiasts, if I can call you that, and stakeholders. First and foremost, the topic and discussion here today is the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. And in the terms of what that means is we have to understand that that is, of course, an immediate impact as well as a sustained impact over the longer term. In terms of Gaza, there's three key figures that explains the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. And this is, of course, 2.1 million people, which is the population. 1.9 million people got displaced, and 1.2 million people's homes were destroyed. The human impact, as per the recent RDNA that were released, is essentially 77 years where people got pushed back in life. That means that where we are today in 2026, people will be pushed back 77 years before they are able to recover. With that being said, in the context of Gaza, there is no, unfortunately, like some of our other programs, we don't have a national authority that we are dealing with in that context. So what do we do? What do we do in a context like Gaza where the needs are there? Early recovery is now come to the forefront. We have the humanitarian needs still persisting. And how do we ultimately deliver the impact of these activities in an environment like that? What we've seen, of course, in conflict areas, and it's happening more and more across the world now, is that mine action is essentially shifted from the classic enabler of humanitarian assistance to something that is real-time and part of the risk mitigation process of the humanitarian system, of the early recovery system, and how to deliver operations efficiently and safely by humanitarian actors across the board. Now in the Gaza, there's a few examples of that we'll be looking at now at this point in time, and we can see that it starts off with humanitarian delivery. Since the start of the conflict in October 2023, UNMAS, as well as our partners that's working alongside each other, were there to enable the delivery of humanitarian aid throughout the conflict. We never left, so while the conflict was persisting, we were there all throughout. We were basically delivering and supporting by undertaking certain activities, supporting interagency missions. This means that where food delivery was happening, medical supplies were being transported, UNMAS was there assessing those roads, making sure that it's safe to move along. When there's areas, food distribution points, hospitals, anywhere where some sort of a displacement of sort happens and there's shelter needs and we need to assess a new area, we were there as mine action assessing those areas and providing mitigation advice. That means that in the absence of having an ability to positively, address an explosive ordnance threat, we were there essentially providing advice and mitigation in the sense, if there's a danger and we don't have the means, let's move, let's assess a different area, let's go to an area to try to mitigate the risk. With that being said, the delivery of explosive hazard assessments has been quite a key activity in it. And if we look on average about some of our analysis that we have done, it's not only what we couldn't do by not being able to destroy anything, but it's the 60% of the tasks which we enabled. That means that by assessing it and being able to provide that advice, we've to 60% of the requests, we're able to basically provide the assistance and the reassurance as part of the risk mitigation to be able to proceed with the delivery of that specific project or that task and that intervention. The next slide, please. Thank you. Now, of course, as we are discussing this and bring it back to the area that I want to discuss is what is the responsibility of the humanitarian community in the absence of some of our, we've got wonderful colleagues here at the NDM from different mine action centers and national authorities, but what is our responsibility as the humanitarian community to lead on and how do we ultimately make sure that that is being done? First and foremost, we can all agree that the value of coordination cannot be underestimated. This is something that we are very much all interested in in having a well-coordinated sector. And it's never been as important as in today's circumstances where funding is diminishing, where funding is essentially getting less and less. So therefore, it's more important for us to make sure that each and every dollar that we get allocated to mine action, that we apply it first and foremost in a prioritized area, deconflicted, and not duplicate in an absence of duplication of efforts. The responsibilities of the Mine Action Center, ensuring the prioritization, the tasking, all of those were assumed by UNMAS in the context of Gaza, working closely with our partners such as HI, HALO, MAG, MPA, and all the other organizations, to name a few. I mean, DCA, DRC, we're all having ongoing discussions and at various degrees, but everybody is vested in moving forward in mine action in Gaza. So in different levels, you know, whether it's the delivery of explosive ordnance risk education, whether it's the delivery of explosive hazard assessments, whether it's supporting interagency missions, or whether it's advocating for the sector, because all of us have got different relationships with different member states, and it's all a joint initiative, a joint project of how we come together advocating for the needs, the mine action needs of Gaza. Now, what's very important in what we've been able to do in the context of Gaza is, if we look at the size of Gaza in comparison to some of the similar areas around, you know, and I'll just point to my colleague's area of responsibility there on the far left, is if we take Syria, which is our neighbor crisis, of course, and we look at the amount of people, the population there, you know, and you take the area, we're looking at about 120 people per square kilometer. The same in Gaza before the war was close to 6,000 people per square kilometer. That means if you put 12 steps that direction, 12 steps that direction, that is the living space of one individual prior to the war. And now with certain things that's happening, there are certain realities on the ground that has more than halved. Now the needs are there. By identifying 980 positive explosive ordnance, not through a systematic manner, but basically responding to that task, it means that about 1 in 3 tasks has come up with a positive explosive ordnance being identified there. We are talking conventional mine action, conventional explosive ordnance. We are talking improvised explosive ordnance, and the full spectrum thereof. 81% of the structures is essentially damaged in Gaza. So there is a lot of debris contamination, EO contamination within the debris, and that is also one of the key things on how we're going to go and embark on the early recovery and reconstruction phases, is essentially most probably the hand removal of explosives, because there's not enough space to evacuate people from. It's not that you can evacuate people in the context of Gaza to address the problem and then bring them back. So it is a real-time challenge based on the small space that we are working in. There's some of the figures that I just referenced to. Sorry, I jumped the gun a little bit, but there it points to the different areas that we need, the safety distances that we need for conventional mine action. We can just take the first one. We need about 300 meters of evacuation to make sure that there's sufficient safety before we can address something as small as a hand grenade. Now, I just explained to you 12 meters is not a lot of space where people are. So imagine trying to evacuate people in a densely populated area. Next slide, please. So lastly, I've also covered this quickly, where we are in IMAS and where we want to be in conventional mine action through non-technical survey, technical survey, clearance operations. All of this is still in the advocacy phase on how we try to move forward, how do we unlock the sector. It's all small steps in the context of Gaza, and every small step that we achieve is essentially a leap for our joint initiative and how we move forward. You know, and how we ultimately get to the point of having that tripartite relationship between the government, the landowner, and the clearance entity in line with land release principles is something that we are still far off, and how we need to get to in the far future. Last slide, please. So these are some of the examples that I'll just quickly mention, is like how we've enabled it. In Al Hali Hospital is essentially where we were requested to do an assessment for an emergency surgical tent to be put up. This was an area that was subjected to heavy fighting. We were responding, we were helping there, and we were enabling them by identifying a safe area within the rubble, essentially, or amongst the rubble, on where they could put up a tent, which was critical in providing life-saving aid in an area that, you know, in a context where there's only about 40% of the medical facilities still available. The second one is Al Shifa Hospital, by enabling them and the rehabilitation of the desalination plant, that also enabled us to provide clean clean water alongside our colleagues. We didn't provide it, but we enabled the delivery of clean water to about 300,000 people in the immediate vicinity. And then lastly, the IDP camp, where there was also some contamination and was reported, was essentially shared with us, is where an explosive ordnance, a suspected explosive ordnance, was in a tent. And people were just living amongst it. You know, they didn't know what to do with it. There was no capacity to respond to it. They didn't before reporting it to us, and they were just living amongst it. When it was reported to us in collaboration with the camp manager, we responded. It was a rainy day, as you can see on the photo, but it was something that we prioritized to make sure that the protection of civilian is something that is at the core of what we are doing there. I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julius. I just noticed that there are many people standing. I don't know if it's possible to open the interpreter booth. I can see that there's at least 6 or even more seats. If anybody wants to sit there, that's what we had done last year. And if really it's hard for you to stay standing the whole time, please raise your hand and maybe someone will be kind enough to kind of get you a seat. Really apologies for the inconvenience, but it's not as bad as having your house destroyed and then having to wonder if there is an explosive ordnance in there before you can go in. Thank you very much, Julius, for those remarks. And now it is my pleasure to give the floor to Dr. Al-Asnani from Iraq. Thank you.
صباح الخير أيها الزملاء الموقرون، يشرفني أن أشارك في هذه الجلسة المهمة. عنوان العرض هو الإطار القانوني والتحديات بين إزالة مخلفات الحرب وحماية التراث الثقافي. في أعقاب المناقشات حول ما تم طرحه سأقدم بإيجاز منظور العراق مع التركيز على البيئات التي تتقاطع فيها مخلفات الحرب المتفجرة مع المناطق الحضرية المكتظة بالسكان ومواقع التراث الثقافي، ولا ينصب تركيزي على المقارنة بين السياقات المختلفة بل على إبراز تحدي تشغيلي مشترك يظهر في هذه السياقات. في العراق كما في العديد من بيئات ما بعد النزاع تتركز بشكل متزايد مخلفات الحرب المتفجرة داخل المناطق السكنية الحضرية، وهذه المناطق ليست فضاءات تشغيلية معزولة بل تتداخل مع البنى التحتية والحياة المدنية ومواقع التراث الثقافي، ويؤدي ذلك إلى خلق بيئة تشغيلية معقدة، حيث يجب أن تراعى عمليات التطهير عدة اعتبارات في آن واحد. وعليه فإن التحدي لا يقتصر على الجوانب التقنية فحسب، بل يمتد أيضا إلى قضايا التنسيق والتخطيط. وتتمثل النقطة الأساسية التي أود طرحها في أن الأمر لا يتعلق بالمفاضلة بين إزالة الألغام لأغراض إنسانية وحماية التراث الثقافي، إذ تظل الإزالة الإنسانية ذات أولوية كاملة في التنفيذ الميداني. غير أن التكامل يمكن أن بل وينبغي أن يتحقق في مرحلة مبكرة على المستوى التخطيطي والتنسيقي، وهذا يعني أن القرارات التشغيلية يمكن أن تعكس قبل الشروع الميداني كلا من الاعتبارات الإنسانية والسياقية، ومن شأن ذلك أن يقلل من المخاطر في الميدان بدلا من زيادة تعقيدها. البيئة الحضرية بعد النزاع في العراق. تمثل البيئات الحضرية بعد النزاع في العراق سياق بالغ التعقيد، حيث تتعايش مخلفات الحرب القابلة للانفجار مع مناطق سكنية مكتظة إلى جانب مواقع ذات قيمة ثقافية وتاريخية عالية. هذا التداخل يخلق واقع لا تكون فيه الملوثات منفصلة بل متداخلة مع الحياة اليومية للمجتمعات. ففي المدن الخارجة من النزاع غالبا ما تتواجد هذه المخلفات إلى جانب المنازل مباشرة والبنى التحتية والمواقع التاريخية. وتزداد درجة التعقيد في المناطق ذات الكثافة السكانية العالية، حيث تتقاطع اعتبارات الوصول والسلامة والحساسيات الاجتماعية بشكل مباشر. وفي هذا السياق تبرز الحاجة إلى فهم تشغيلي متكامل يأخذ بعين الاعتبار الترابط بين أعمال الإزالة الإنسانية والتعافي الحضري وحماية التراث الثقافي. بالنسبة للتحديات التشغيلية، ففي البيئة الحضرية تفرض مخلفات الحرب القابلة للانفجار تحديات تشغيلية متعددة. غالبا ما تتداخل هذه المخلفات مع البنى التحتية المدنية بما في ذلك المساكن والطرق وكذلك الخدمات الأساسية، مما يتطلب تنفيذ أعمال الإزالة بدرجة عالية من الدقة والحذر. وفي العديد من الحالات تقع هذه المناطق بالقرب من مواقع التراث الثقافي، الأمر الذي يزيد من حساسية العمليات ويستلزم تنسيقا دقيقا لتجنب أي ضرر غير مقصود. وفي الوقت ذاته لا يزال التنسيق ما بين القطاعات بحاجة إلى المزيد من التطوير، حيث تعمل الجهات الإنسانية وقطاعات إعادة الإعمار والجهات المعنية بالتراث في كثير من الأحيان بشكل متوازي. وتوفر حالة مدنية لدينا هي حالة مدينة الموصل مثالا واضح في جامع النوري الكبير والمتمثل باسم الحدباء. طبعا هذه كانت جدا معقدة بسبب أنه يعني آثار مدمرة من قبل عصابات داعش الإرهابية وبوسط البيوت، وكذلك يجب الحفاظ على هذه الآثار عند ما يتم تطهيرها. كل هذه كانت تعقيدات واجهت الجهات التي قامت بتطهير هذا المكان. ففي أغلب المعارك مع هذه العصابات واجهت المدينة تلوثا واسع النطاق بمخلفات الحرب المتفجرة في مناطق حضرية متعددة ومكتظة بالسكان. فلذلك هذه التعقيدات كان لابد من تنفيذ عمليات التطهير وجهود إعادة الإعمار بالتوازي، مما استلزم تنسيق وثيق بين الفاعلين الإنسانيين وأصحاب المصلحة في مجال التراث. ويعد هذا المثال الذي طبعا هذا الجامع يبلغ بناء بالقرن ال12 الميلادي، وهو صرح كبير يعتبر من يعني الصرح الأكبر في العراق وخاصة في محافظة الموصل، حيث كان لابد من إدارة جهود التعافي واعتبارات السلامة بعناية ضمن بيئة تشغيلية واحدة. ومن جانب آخر يمثل هذا الجامع الصرح الكبير بتقاطع إزالة مخلفات الحرب مع حماية هذا التراث المهم بعد تدميره وتلوثه بالمخلفات المتفجرة. فتطلبت عمليات الإزالة دقة عالية وتقييد استخدام الآليات الثقيلة والتنسيق مع الأمم المتحدة للأعمال المتعلقة من خلال اليو ان ماس واليونسكو كذلك دخلت في إعادة هذا الإعمار. وتظهر هذه الحالة أن إزالة المخاطر في المواقع التراثية ليست مجرد عملية تقنية، بل هي أيضا عملية استعادة للهوية الثقافية التاريخية. وبناء على ذلك تصبح عمليات الإزالة في المناطق الحضرية ذات حساسية عالية وتتطلب ليس فقط يعني خبرة فنية، بل أيضا تنسيق وتخطيط وتكييف مستمر مع الواقع. آثار التلوث في البيئة الحضرية تنعكس هذه الآثار على عدة مستويات، فالتأخير في تنفيذ عمليات الإزالة الآمنة يؤدي إلى إبطاء وتيرة التعافي، وفي الوقت ذاته يزيد من مستوى المخاطر التشغيلية التي تواجه فرق العمل والمجتمعات المتأثرة. كما أن هذه التأخيرات تفرض قيود على أنشطة إعادة الإعمار وتحدي من القدرة على استعادة البنى التحتية والخدمات الأساسية، مما يزيد من الضغط على أنظمة الاستجابة الإنسانية. الدروس المستفادة والممارسات الجيدة. يكمن التحدي الأساسي في وضع سؤال مهم هو كيف يمكن إزالة التهديدات التي تهدد حياة الإنسان دون أن نمحو في الوقت ذاته جذور الهوية التاريخية. في ضوء ذلك برزت مجموعة من الدروس المستفادة من التجربة العراقية. طبعا العراق لديه تجارب متعددة في النهوض بالواقع وخاصة بالمجال التراثي، لكن تم اختيار الجامع النوري بهذا المثال فقط. أولا بعد التكامل المبكر في مرحلة التخطيط أمرا أساسيا، وهذا يعد أمر أساسي، حيث أن إدماج اعتبارات إزالة المخلفات ضمن خطط إعادة الإعمار وحماية التراث منذ البداية يسهم وبشكل كبير في تحسين النتائج. ثانيا تبرز أهمية تعزيز التنسيق بين القطاعات المختلفة بما في ذلك الجهات الإنسانية وقطاعات البنى التحتية والجهات المعنية بالتراث، بما يضمن تقليل الازدواجية وتحقيق كفاءة أعلى. ثالثا تلعب آليات تبادل البيانات دورا محوريا في دعم اتخاذ القرار المبني على الأدلة وتحديد أولويات التداخل في المناطق ذات التأثير الأعلى. حقيقة بشكل عام فإن تحسين عملية اتخاذ القرار في المراحل المبكرة يسهم بشكل مباشر في تحقيق نتائج أكثر استدامة وكفاءة. الوضع الحالي للتلوث في العراق على المستوى الوطني يمكن ويعكس أيضا الوضع الحالي للتلوث في العراق مزيج من التقدم والتحديات المستمرة، حيث لا تزال مساحة تقدر بحوالي أكثر من 2000 كيلو متر مربع مصنفة كمناطق مفتوحة وخطرة وتشكل تهديد مباشر. وفي المقابل تم إطلاق ما يقارب 4011 كيلو متر مربع بعد تطهيرها وإعلانها آمنة، وهو ما يعكس جهود تشغيلية مستمرة، كما أن هنالك 454 كيلو متر مربع قيد المعالجة حاليا، مما يدل على استمرار العمليات لمعالجة ما تبقى من التلوث. ورغم أن هذه الأرقام تعكس تقدم ملموس إلا أنها في الوقت ذاته تعتبر وذات حجم تحدي متبقي، لا سيما والبيانات المعقدة التي تتطلب موارد إضافية وتخطيطا دقيقا. في الخاتمة اسمحوا لي أن أختتم مداخلتي بالنقاط التالية. أولا لم تعد إزالة مخلفات الحرب مجرد عملية إنسانية أو تقنية، بل أصبحت تحدي متعدد الأبعاد يتطلب تكامل بين الأطر القانونية والثقافية والتشغيلية. ثانيا السرعة دون ضوابط تؤدي إلى خسائر لا يمكن تعويضها، يجب أن تحمي عمليات الإزالة الإنسان والهوية معا. ثالثا مع وجود ما يقارب أكثر من 2000 كيلو متر مربع من الأراضي الملوثة في العراق، فإن عمليات الإزالة ليست خيارا بل ضرورة أساسية لتحقيق الاستقرار وإعادة الإعمار، وإن هذه الأراضي ليست مجرد مساحات فارغة، بل هي مدن وطبقات حضارية وكذلك مواقع تراثية ذات قيمة إنسانية عالية. ما نلاحظه ليس غيابا في الأطر القانونية بل الحاجة إلى تكاملها وتطبيقها. ففي العراق شكلنا لجنة وطنية عليا لشؤون الألغام برئاسة رئيس الوزراء وعضوية عدد من الوزارات والجهات الأمنية، ومهامها الرئيسية هي رسم السياسات الاستراتيجية لبرنامج شؤون الألغام في العراق. كذلك قامت دائرة شؤون الألغام وبدعم من برنامج الأمم المتحدة للأعمال المتعلقة بالألغام UN بإصدار المعيار الوطني لعمليات التنظيف الأمنية. وكذلك الحل لا يكمن في إنشاء أطر جديدة بل في تحقيق التكامل ما بين الأطر القانونية والمؤسسات والعمليات الميدانية. وأخيرا العراق يمتلك الإرادة من خلال دعمكم، وشكرا لكم.
شكرا جدا. It was a wonderful statement. And really, I think one very good lesson is also to have really high-level engagement from the government. I think having the Prime Minister and having an interministerial committee to really put mine action at the center of your reconstruction was a key to success, and I hope that other countries will do the same. Thank you very much. Now let's move to Joe McCarthan for one mass Syria, please.
Thanks, Christelle. I think the first thing I'd like to say is this is the first NDM at which a Syrian National Mine Action Centre has been represented, and we have Ms. Hiba El Sheikh at the back of the room, so thank you. Let's hope I don't fluff my lines in front of the new authority. Syria is entering or has entered a post-conflict stage, but I think the important thing to consider is that the sheer destruction in Syria is quite incredible. It goes from the Jordanian border all the way to the Turkish border, and it goes from the Mediterranean all the way to the Iraqi border. Essentially, all of populated Syria has been affected by the conflict at some stage over the last 14 years. And before the conflict, Syria was a middle-income country. And it's been estimated that something like 40% of all housing stock in Syria has been either damaged or completely destroyed. So try applying that to your own particular countries and then consider what that means for Syria. And it's not just housing stock, it's the infrastructure as well. The water systems, the sewage, the schools, the hospitals, the sorts of infrastructure that people rely on in urban environments to live normal lives. And as in Iraq, cultural sites have been destroyed as well. The UNESCO World Heritage Site in Aleppo, badly damaged in the conflict. And I think the World Bank has estimated that the repair bill for Syria is over 200 billion. Next slide, please. But what I really want to talk about is not the destruction, it's the centrality of mine action in the recovery process and the necessity to build it into a multi-ministerial approach. And that requires a strong National Mine Action Centre, because it's their role really to coordinate across ministries. Ministerial planning in a post-conflict environment such as Syria cannot be siloed. The Ministry of Electricity, for instance, can't make a plan to reconnect Syria, the Syrian power, unless there is a mine action response. Next slide, please. So it's not only just an interministerial response that is required. The UN has an important role to play as international experts, and you know, UN planning when it comes to reconstruction must include a mine action response as well. For example, if UNICEF is looking to rehabilitate schools, then it's pointless getting the funding to do that unless there is a mine action component. And that's why UNMAS is engaging with the other agencies, funds and programs, so that mine action is embedded at the planning stage, and then that we can coordinate not only with the National Mine Action Centre, but also with the various operators within the country. We'll also be developing a donor group, a Friends of Mine Action in Syria, so that donor nations will also then get the message centrally that their funding response needs to be coordinated not only with the National Mine Action Centre, but then also, you know, should, as I say, include a humanitarian mine action response as well. Next slide, please. But I think the thing to really consider is that mine action in Syria is very much in its infancy. Yes, mine action organizations have been there throughout the entire conflict, but really the National Mine Action Centre, as I've said, is new. It's something like 6 months old. There are 7 people working for it at the moment. It doesn't have the depth of knowledge that is required just yet. And again, the UNMAS is working with them in a mentoring role and a capacity building role together with GICHD and the mine action partners within Syria in order to develop national mine action standards. These have not existed in Syria up until this point. There is no coordinated IM system that can be used to provide information that is necessary towards developing the national priorities. Again, that is something that we are doing. And we're also working to ensure that the accreditation and the quality assurance process will be totally delivered by the National Mine Action Centre as well. Next slide, please. So when it comes to, specifically to the issue of rubble removal, I personally regard this as being a civil engineering task. What I think mine action operators cannot do is be completely prescriptive and require that all explosive hazards are removed. It is simply impossible to search through all of the rubble everywhere within Syria and ensure that all explosive hazards are removed before the rubble is processed. We need to take a pragmatic approach and one that is very much a risk management approach. Whether it is the use of banksmen on site who can positively identify items, or whether it is working with various civil contractors in a risk education role to help them identify hazards as rubble is being removed. For example, HALO were working in a suburb of Damascus over the last few months called Jobar, heavily impacted by the crisis. It was under siege for about 4 years, I believe. And their rubble removal, it was essentially to open up the roads so that people could return and start rebuilding. And they took the approach that if they could see visible hazards, along with ICRC as well, they very much took the approach of removing the rubble, just identifying visible hazards and moving on. And I think, as I say, we need to be pragmatic in our approach to the issue of explosive hazards, because if we're not, then frankly, civil engineering companies are there with a particular contract, and if we're over heavy and over prescriptive, they will simply ignore humanitarian mine action and take their own risks. Next slide, please. Just a few final general thoughts. The world, as we know, is increasingly urbanizing. So conflict will be centered more and more around cities, as we've seen in Gaza, as we've seen in Iraq, as we are seeing in Syria and elsewhere. And therefore, we're going to need to factor the issue of clearance in urban areas more into our planning and into our standard setting. And I think, as in the case of Syria, the issue of contamination is completely cross-cutting. It goes to the heart of the reconstruction of a country like Syria, and therefore it requires a multi-ministerial approach with a strong national mine action centre that can pull together all of the various strands and ensure that it is embedded within the ministerial planning. And that requires, frankly, it is also important, therefore, that the process is owned nationally and not by international organizations such as the United Nations. I'll hand back to Christelle.
Thank you very much, Joe, for putting these lessons and final thoughts on the table. I have a list of excellent questions to ask, but I'm sure you do too. So we're going to go to your question and observations. There is room here for people who are behind Alioun. You know, I see also colleagues from Austria, which makes me think about the declaration of explosive weapons in populated area, which I hope all of you have signed or are pushing for. Really, it's really not a good idea to use explosive weapons in populated areas. This is just so awful, especially when you think about the years it took people to build those cities, and to see them destroyed like this, it is just unfathomable. So, your questions, please, you have the floor. And before I give you the floor, just one more thing. I want to thank donors very much, those who have helped Iraq to turn the red into green. Thank you very much. I see the European Union is there, Switzerland, I mean, many others. Well, thank you very much for your support, and I hope you will also help Sudan, Syria, and OPT to move forward and also become green and remove all these red dots that are so dangerous. Please raise your hand, introduce yourself, and put your question. Don't be shy. If not, we can all go and have coffee. Or I'll ask my own question. All right, I'll get. My question is to Julius. How do you actually remove unexploded bombs in densely populated areas?
Thank you very much, Christel. I think when it comes to this, there's two aspects of that. There's the technical aspect of how do we actually go about in removing the threat, which is, as I'm sure that many of our colleagues in this room are technically inclined and capable of understanding that process. It's a very specialized process, a lot of resources that we require, and one of those key resources is critical equipment. That equipment are currently being classed as dual-use equipment in most of the context that we work in, and especially in Gaza, you know that there's a lot of challenges in getting those dual-use equipment into Gaza. I'm not only talking about exploders to initiate an explosive charge. I'm talking about on our shelter, shelter cluster, they have been trying and pushing to get tent poles into Gaza. So if we cannot get a tent pole into Gaza, getting in something as explosives, which I assume we can all agree is the ultimate dual-use item, because it can either be used for very good purposes or very bad purposes, it's going to be close to impossible getting that into Gaza right now. So that means that where we are right now, we don't have the ability, we don't have the capacity to, and capacity I don't mean about the skill sets, we've got very capable people in Gaza, but we don't have the equipment and the stores required to actually do the demolition, to actually remove the items, to destroy them, and to take them away in a sustainable manner. I've actually used the analogy the other day when somebody asked me, it's like, why are you guys not doing more? I said, it's not because we don't want to do more. The analogy would be if you bring 10 doctors around a sick person with, let's not even say a severe case, a simple case of flu, and you told them that there's the patient, but you cannot do anything. That's the level of frustration that Mine Action is experiencing as a whole, not UNMAS, but the sector. All my partners that I see around the room, we're all experiencing that frustration because we are all capable of dealing it, but we don't have the ability and we don't have the necessary deconflicting mechanisms to be able to perform those activities. That's why I mentioned in our context, we're very much focused on a risk mitigation aspect thereof and making sure that we can enable what we can enable and try to safeguard human lives, as well as to make sure that we can actually deliver prioritized humanitarian aid. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Yes? So if you could introduce yourself.
Thank you. Zahruddin, Chief Mine Action Program in South Sudan. I had a chance to be in Gaza 3 months, 2024, and we have been talking about the plans, following the early recovery plan, debris management, and apart from having explosive ordnances in destroyed buildings, we also had another challenge, and that is a lot of human remains in those destroyed buildings. So the question came as how are we going to manage removing or destroying explosive ordnances while you still have human remains over there that can be then spread. So that was a challenge that I believe is still ongoing, discussion with the ICRC and whomever is considered to be responsible for this.
Great, thank you very much, Ed. And that's very much true. Again, that brings two angles to it. It's the immediate, how do we work around the site where there's human remains, and therefore we rely on our IMAS, or international recognized standards and approaches based on best practices when it comes to how do we go around it. But then, of course, we also have the advocacy aspect of it. It's like, what do we further than that? On the ground, pragmatically, we've got a very close relationship with our colleagues from the World Health Organization, who's working and also plugging into the services that's remaining, the few ambulances that's still working. So where explosive, or let's say where human remains are located on work sites, there's a process and a procedure how we report that and how those human remains actually get recovered. But then it's also not what we do pragmatically, it's also what we do, and our wonderful colleagues from the EU, that has been pushing on some of the projects to actually be included on how do we deal with human remains. Very recently we have a project that I think it's just been signed for our colleagues on UNDP on early recovery, and in there the EU insisted on a clause and how are we going to deal specifically with human remains, and therefore also promoting the collaboration with our colleagues from ICRC on how do we identify the remains, how do we incorporate DNA analysis and try to track the family and the relatives of those human remains. So I think that's also a very important aspect, that how we deal with it, and it comes back to the coordination aspect of it. We have to have systems in place that we talk to each other. We can do it from the bottom up, and then also from the donor level and member states. How do you advocate for the inclusion of these very sensitive and very valuable and human elements of the work that we do in your grants, in your proposals, in the things that you do when you allocate those funds to implement this, not only mine action, but also in early recovery. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and this points also to the importance of diplomacy and humanitarian diplomacy. I mean, we are in the humanitarian capital of the world, to try to, gain access and get authorization to bring in the equipment and to do what's needed. So it's an appeal also to the diplomats in the room to help us on that front. Are there any recommendations from you, if you could advise the panel on what are the other recommendations or lessons you have learned in your career that you would like to share? Please, if you could introduce yourself and share with us.
And I don't have a question, but I just want to introduce a new tool for dealing with explosives, especially in urban areas. We have a product. It's a chemical product. It can be shipped anywhere in the world, either by sea, by land, or by air. You take the product, it's a powder, you mix with water, and you add to explosives. It destroys the explosives, and the end product is a non-hazardous waste. The product is called Munirem. This allows for decontamination of surfaces, destruction of bulk explosives, and decontamination of materials. It's just one tool, one additional tool to add to the toolbox, but it allows for rapid and safe destruction of explosives without an explosion. Thank you.
Yeah, Julius, go ahead. Thank you for your intervention.
Thank you very much, and I think that's very important. I'm very happy to see Valentino here today as well, and we've spoken before as well. I think one of the key things, and I don't want to be the only one talking here this morning, but the thing is what's important in especially as we go into the future and more politically driven environments where there are, let's say, security considerations around dual use items such as explosive items, these type of technologies are very valuable. We have been advocating on the platform of the CMCC, which anyone that's familiar with the context of Gaza would understand the CMCC, for Munirem to be brought in. I mean, if the concern is about not bringing in things that are security sensitive, Munirem. Also, we have colleagues, of course, that specialize in thermite. And all these type of low-order mechanisms, Munirem, burn systems, these are the type of technologies where there's really a need in these, let's say, these sensitive environments. So I just want to reiterate the value and how we are also advocating for the application and the importation of these types of technology. Thank you very much, Valentino.
Okay. Any last observation? Oh, please. Colleague from NPA, I believe.
Yes. Good morning, Chris Tierney from Norwegian People's Aid. One of the issues that we have encountered in various different countries is in relation to housing, land and property rights, especially when we were doing clearance in urban areas, unplanned detonations and compensation related to this. So I'd just like to ask the panel if they have any advice for different countries on what legislation that they put in place to be able to protect people who are doing the clearance operations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any last comment? Yes, please. ICRC, right? Is that correct?
Good morning, dear panel. I'm William. I'm currently the Weapon Contamination Coordinator in Syria. And cheers for the Jobar recognition, Joe. As we've heard from the panel and all the questions, this is, to put it bluntly, quite a lot of doom and gloom. I'd like to ask the panel, in your opinion, do you think if money was not an option, was not an obstacle, sorry, do you think we as a sector have the ability, with the resources we have currently, to actually resolve a lot of these issues in what our beneficiaries, who are our main focus and who we're accountable to, what they would consider a reasonable amount of time? Because, did you say 77 years, Julius? You know, that's more than a generation. I think a lot of people would consider that unacceptable. Do you think we can turn that around?
The question, and actually I'm going to ask it to all of you because it's an important question. If somebody could put, let's say, 3 trillion on the table, 4, Apple, I think that's what Apple's worth, right? 4 trillion. Basically, no money is not an issue. You have as much money as you need. What do you do? And do you have the capacity? And how do we build it? I think that's where we're going, right? So I will start maybe with you, Juma.
شكرا على هذا السؤال المداخلة. يمكن كل المشاكل أو أكبر تحدي في أعمال مكافحة الألغام هو توفير الأموال. كل متحدث من المناطق المتضررة يتحدث عن التحدي الكبير هو عدم توفر الأموال. بالتالي المال هو شيء أساسي للتعامل مع كل التحديات المتعلقة بإزالة المخلفات والتوعية. لكن بتوفير المال أنت ممكن تزيد عدد الأتيام بتدريب عدد كبير من العاملين، ممكن تنشر الأتيام، ممكن توفر معدات حديثة تتواكب مع الخطر الموجود. كل ذلك ممكن تفعله بالمال. في حالة عدم توفر الأموال قد تكون بالنسبة لأعمال الإزالة هنالك مشكلة كبيرة في التنفيذ، ولكن في أعمال التوعية اللي هي تستهدف تخفيف الضرر على المواطنين أو تسقيفهم بالمخلفات وبالتالي تخفيف عدد الحوادث، فذلك ممكن كيف بتدريب المجتمعات المحلية على أعمال التوعية. المجتمع المحلي يتمثل في المعلمين، العاملين في المجال الإنساني، رجال الدين، المتطوعين من المواطنين، ممكن تدريبهم لتوصيل الرسائل التوعوية. وكذلك يمكن من خلال المدارس والمناهج المدرسية إضافة مادة تختص بالتوعية بالمخلفات، هي لا تحتاج لكثير من الأموال، وبالتالي ستكون هذه التوعية متناقلة في الأجيال عبر المدارس. هذا يمكن ما يمكن بخصوص التوعية. أما بخصوص بقية أنشطة مكافحة الألغام، مساعدة الضحايا والإزالة، أعتقد أنه المال هو مهم في هذا المجال. شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you very much. Dr. Al-Asnani, from your perspective, do you have capacity or...
لو كان متوفر هذا المبلغ فأول خطوة نعملها هو تطهير المناطق الحضرية المدنية وعودة النازحين إلى ديارهم وجمع عوائلهم المتشتتة حاليا. والخطوة الثانية هو تطهير آثار أور لما لها من أهمية كبرى، وحتى دول العالم تهتم بآثار أور وهي الآن يعني غير مطهرة بالشكل كامل من الألغام. ففي البدء هي العوائل ثم الآثار، وهذه الآثار تلاقي 3 يعني تحديات. التحدي الأول الخطر، والتحدي الثاني هو السكان، والتحدي الثالث هو الهوية الثقافية التراثية. بالتالي هذه تحتاج إلى مبالغ، وكذلك الاهتمام بالضحايا، لأنه لدينا في محافظة البصرة منطقة تسمى بمنطقة البتران، يعني بلا ساق بلا أيدي. هذه المنطقة تحتاج إلى الدعم والاهتمام بهؤلاء الضحايا، إضافة إلى التوعية. شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you very much. And I know that Iraq has also invested a lot of its own budget into mine action, and that's why you've reached this level. Recently, I read a very interesting statistic, is that out of the 4 million people that were displaced by the conflict in Iraq, more than 3 million have already returned, so there's already a good progress, and I think there's only 700,000 IDPs. So congratulations of all your work in that regard. Okay, now Joe and then Julius, and then we'll go and have coffee, and then remember at 10:15 land release plenary, and then this afternoon one plenary donor dialogue where some very important donors are going to talk about their priorities, and then Friday second plenary about money, because money is important, as we've heard, will be about innovative and alternative financing. So this is all linked, but let's go to Julius, and then we go and have coffee. Thank you.
Well, I think, we're not living in fantasy land. Funding is always going to be an issue, and funding is going to get even tighter. But I think mine action operators need to make themselves relevant in a place like Syria. And if we are over-prescriptive in what we're trying to do, then frankly, local companies and local people will just ignore us, and they will take unnecessary risks. I just want to go back quickly to Chris's point about housing, land and property issues. One of the major problems that we are finding when it comes to rubble removal in Syria is that whatever is outside on the street can be removed. That is in the public domain. Any rubble that is in a destroyed housing apartment or a building, if it is removed to be searched, has to be put back inside. Which obviously is something that mine action operators are not able to do. So that really cuts, I think, to the importance of engaging with the national authorities, having the correct legislation in place, and making legislation fit for real-world purpose, in order that operators can work properly. Because frankly, the level of destruction in Syria and the level of displacement and death means that a lot of these buildings may never be occupied again. And I'll take a pause there and hand over to Julius.
Thank you very much. So quickly, I'll start with Chris's question as well. I think it's a very important question. Of course, HLP in Gaza, it's non-existent at this point in time. So I'm not going to talk Gaza specifically, but I think when it comes to the HLP topic in general, I think there's a sequence of responsibility that lays with the relevant authorities that needs to take it. If I use a simple example, security rate, that's explosive ordnance. So again, the searching of rubble, as Joe has mentioned, is a different topic. But when you've identified something that is physically a hazard, do you go in and address it or you don't go in and address it? I think that's a question for the authorities, because if a murder happens on a personal property, it doesn't matter. Murder happened and it gets investigated. I think similarly, if an explosive ordnance doesn't belong to the landowner and it presents a threat to a child running into that property, and the child's not going to ask who's the owner of the land and could get injured, that is a discussion for the authority to have. So I think that there is a broader discussion of what is the precedence or the level of precedence and the ownership of that threat. So sometimes, housing, land and property is very important. I don't want to be disrespectful, don't get me wrong. But I just think when it comes to explosive ordnance that is a real risk to civilians, that is quite, something that needs to be discussed, and there needs to be a national policy around that. Will, back to your question. I think resources is one thing, but of course the problem with explosive ordnance is that we cannot address what we do not know about. So how do we, use the UK as an example, still finding bombs, since World War II. Still up to today when there's construction happening. But I think if we use the same example is how do we embed the resource and the capacity and the ability of a authority in which we work in how to respond to that. I'll be quite honest with you, I do not see a long-term international intervention in terms of response in Gaza. We see a UXO threat, we don't see minefields, we don't see cluster munition strike sites. Therefore, over the medium to the longer term, there needs to be some sort of a national ability to respond to it. We're talking about police, we're talking about specialized teams in the future that can be called. It's got a hotline, like in many of the societies that's sitting around the table, that if you have a problem, there's a hotline. You call it, you report it, and somebody comes and addresses it. That's the way that we will do it long term. I think another thing that plugs into that is how can we globally better make use of mine action resources. We've got many different programs around the world where we've got dormant machines laying around. We've got dormant detectors laying in a store somewhere, and that every time we start a new problem or a new program, we buy new stuff, we buy new equipment. And these equipment that we have in the mine action industry are quite durable. We can all agree to that. Really good detectors, really good equipment, really good machines that partners in this room and around this forum has produced. So I think we should recognize the value in that, and because we use the detector in South Sudan doesn't mean it's no longer good enough to use in Gaza. So I think we should also globally come together and see how can we better make use of the resources that we do have to our ability instead of starting the circle all over again. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe we need a little task force on the equipment because these points keep coming up that we are not managing the equipment as well as we should be. Anyway, thank you so much to our panelists for sharing their